I believe that the conclaves are not meant to be big educational programs, but that more they are sharing. And what we really come to share here is love. It should be a love fest, or an agape is what they call it in Greek, that we're meant to share in love. We all come and share our lives. Maybe it's once a year or maybe twice a year. And our lives are all we really have, all we really have to give. But my life is very different from Betty's. I have a rather quiet life. It's not as social as hers is. And so when I have to give a talk and I want to share from my life, it is a little different for me. We all try to talk from the basis of the Rosicrucian philosophy because that is where our heart is. And we try to share what the Rosicrucian philosophy means in our experience. And Betty just did that wonderfully. We also look for things that inspire us. Sometimes we look at our studies, what we've been reading, how it's changed our thinking, and how it prepares us in our consciousness so we can make a new start. That's what the word initiation really means. It means a start. We start with a whole different kind of consciousness than what we have now. Betty's talks are always a perfect example. My talks can't be like Betty's. I'm a bachelor. As much as possible, I'm a loner. So I don't have all of those family experiences like Betty does. And my life is, in some ways, a not good life. I call too many shots in my life. My life, I don't have to answer to anybody. My life is too much in my own hands. And what was that old Chinese statement? It's all right to fall into a woman's arms, but never into her hands.
Who wrote that? Anonymous? Solomon B. Stevenson.
But at any rate, I get to call too many shots in my life. And that's not always good for growth. So in lieu of having a really big personal life, I have a thought life. Mercury is an extremely strong life ruler in my chart. In fact, Mercury is equal to just about all of the other planets put together in my chart. I can't even open a matchbook without going into all kinds of thought about it. So, what I'm going to share are some of my recent thoughts, and some of my recent thoughts on one thing. I have Mercury in Scorpio, and I also have the Sun in Scorpio. No, I'm not going to talk about that one. So I'm going to talk about a scorpionic subject. I'm just going to touch on a few things, and that is the subject of birth and death. And I'm going to make some very strongly opinionated statements, but I promise not to pound my fist in my hand. But it will be, at some points, it will be like that. And all of us are seeking for freedom. We don't want to be in bondage to sin or our desires or whatever else. We want to be free. And so this talk is also to talk about freedom. Birth and death are terminals in our little journey, our little sojourn in this outer physical world. lot of peculiarities about birth and death, such that when we're born here, we die to full waking consciousness in the spiritual worlds. We lose a lot of our inwardness. And that's what the fall into matter is all about. We fall into a lot of illusion about outwardness. In this world, we only see the outside of things. Even if we take something and cut it open, we don't see the inside. All we see is another outside. We're always seeing outward things. So there's something about our relationship to this dense physical world that has a scorpionic deathliness about it. Because in order to get at the inner meaning, which Scorpio certainly tries to do, we have to destroy something, or we have to kill something. Most of us are not in that place that we can see through things and look into their inner being, both in its formation and in its meaning, without killing it. That's where we're all trying to get at, but we're not there. So we see that birth is a terminal condition. It terminates the kind of consciousness that we used to have in the spiritual world. Because our journey here is part of a cyclical process that goes on in eternity, that is timeless, there are all kinds of paradoxes. There's all kinds of ironic symmetry, just like the kind that we've looked at, that birth is a death at the same time. So just for a few minutes, I'd like to look at some of those paradoxical things. If we look from the viewpoint of eternal things, birth and death are not so much terminals as they are transition points. In a way, they're like walking through a doorway. You go from one kind of consciousness to another kind of consciousness. If we think that way, all of our fear about death and all of our apprehension about death and all of the pain that there is around birth, they're not important things in themselves alone. They're just conditions that accompany transition. And if we can look with that higher consciousness, the transitional fears or the birth pangs are as nothing relative to the bigger kind of view that we're getting. But just because we're capable of having that eternal view and not being locked into the earthly material fear of death doesn't mean that we're free from delusions about those terminals. And it doesn't mean that those terminals themselves, birth and death, are unreal or that they're unimportant, because they are important. Because beside being transition points, they are objective points. They're marking points that by relating our lives to those two distinct, definite points of birth and death, we can come to some objective understandings. It's not greatly different from pacing ourselves if we have to run a race. If we know that there is an objective that we have to get to, we can pace ourselves accordingly. And if we're timing ourselves, we have an objectivity and we know how well we're doing in running the race. My suspicion is that most folks dread the humiliation having to experience the consequences of their deeds more than they actually fear death. They know it's going to be objective whether they like it or not. We're all going to be faced with those things, and the Christ within us will say, did you love? When there are different kinds of circumstances and we can see what we actually did. From one point of view, if we have steeped ourselves in inward creativity, the way we do in between lives, and we've seen the grand conception of the cosmos, we're in third heaven, and we can see the idea, we can see the purpose of it all, and we're filled with a creative impulse. We have all kinds of thoughts about it, and we're very creative about it. That doesn't do us anything unless we can actually approach that other terminal point, birth. Because unless we can bring it down to the proving ground, and unless we can test out our understanding of reality, all of the creativity, all of the thinking, all of the feeling is not worth very much. When we give birth to something, even the most limited kind of giving birth, we have to cut away all of the fat of the ideas that we have along the way. It's a matter, does it work? Yes, no, or maybe, or conditionally. Life in this regard isn't meant to be painless, nor is it meant to be painful either. Those are just attributes that we have to understanding whether we have objectively created something, or they are ways of judging the consequences of our deeds after we have brought them to material fruition in the proving ground. Geez, this sounds awfully much like a lecture instead of just a talk.
No, it's good.
There are a number of ironic paradoxes about the different phases of the life cycle and of the terminals of birth and death. There are way too many. Rosalie already said to me, that's way too big of a subject to talk about. And so I'm copping out. I'm only going to talk about a very few things. Let's look very briefly at one or two of these ironies about the terminals and look at them how they pertain to freedom. Via the Rosicrucian philosophy, and as much of it as we have experienced, we're at least vaguely aware of how death frees us from the cramping conditions of the dense physical body. Our consciousness expands to the extent of our solar universe, and we have the objectivity of a God's eye perspective of everything that we've done. At least if we have cultured those abilities while we're here. Like what we do after we die depends on how much we have developed our abilities here to use our inner faculties. One thing that we often do not realize is that we have a great freedom here in the dense physical world. Various people at various times in history have looked at our blinded from the inner eye of intuition and spiritual insight. Our blinded living here in the dense physical body has been seen in various ways. Some people have seen it as a prison where we're serving out a sentence. Other people have seen it as a quarantine. It's like with the SARS virus, we're quarantined from the rest of the cosmos because we're diseased, we're spiritually diseased. There are various different metaphors that have been used at different times. But no matter what the metaphor may be, whether it's a prison or a quarantine or an exile, when we are here physically, we have a very special kind of freedom. We are unique in the dense physical world, and it's a very special kind of uniqueness. We are the only beings that bring at least a modicum of spiritual self-consciousness to the dense physical world. Other creatures, such as the animals, perceive the dense physical world, but they don't have a waking self-consciousness of themselves inside of it. The gods, the spiritual hierarchies, have self-consciousness and they have creativity, but they don't have the outward perception that we have in this dense physical world with its perfect objectivity through all of the limitations. We are very unique beings. We really are the eyes and ears of God. God doesn't have an eyeball. And with our self-consciousness, we are very unique beings here. So the gods have to work indirectly with regard to this world. The lords of destiny or the recording angels can influence us one way or another through astrology, but they're always working indirectly. And they have an inner idea of the forms that come to be in this physical world, but they don't have the outside view of it. So we are very special people here, and we have a lot of freedom. And we have freedom of a kind that no being in heaven can take away from us. We begin our freedom here and not in heaven. It's a very unusual way of looking at it, but that's what it really is. And the funny thing is that our freedom is born through the most stringent kinds of limitations. And it is testable. Now this is a really ironic thing, which we have two engineers in the crowd, and the engineers will both appreciate this, that the irony is that this world is so exacting and it never lets us get away with anything. Just exactly like Betty said, there isn't one little thing that we can get away with. But any engineer can tell you, we can't perfectly measure this world. All we have are better and better approximations, and it's so ironic that we have this perfect, can't get away with anything in the most imperfect of all worlds, and that we begin our freedom in the most unfree kind of state. So there are all kinds of ironies like this. These are general ironies about the whole cycle of life and the cycle of freedom. Now we want to get to the terminals, to birth and death. And with birth and death both, there are ironic paradoxes. One peculiar irony about birth or rebirth is, even though it is a birth into a freedom in the material world, we're not free to do it ourselves. We're not free to be born by ourselves. We may choose to be reborn, as we do in third heaven. We may choose who our parents will be, if we're very lucky, and we can choose how we would like to fulfill the great creative ideas, but we can't be reborn on our own, at least not yet. We're dependent on the wonderful generosity of others to give us our freedom in the material world. Our parents, without their generosity, we couldn't have been born to freedom. So we come to freedom in sort of a dependence. It's not really a dependence, but it's a harmonious working with others. In that we have a reenactment of our whole journey into matter every time we're reborn. We pass from the realm of universality to the realm of singularity and individuality. At one time our consciousness was the consciousness of the cosmos, and now we have our own individual world of consciousness. And so we come to our personal singularity through the broader vehicle of our parents. From the perspective of the person, birth is limited by necessity. When we come into this world, we come into the world of time. And in time, whether we look at that time linearly or circularly or spirally, events are strung out in time. They're not everywhere simultaneously or everywhere at once in the eternal. So we have a necessity of binding of cause and consequences strung out. And our freedom, born out of necessity, goes on in a chain of life when we, by our generosity, give form to somebody else to be born. So there's a whole linear kind of way. So having children is a matter of freedom. It's a matter of creative giving. But freedom, especially at our infantile state, is a matter of degree. Some of us have very little freedom. I've been around barroom brawls and seen the person who started the fight say something exactly like this: I had to hit him. He was after me, and he was going to get me. No choice there, no freedom. I had to do it. And it's surprising how in most crimes this is exactly the attitude that the criminal has. I have no choice but to do it, and to do it this way. As far as birth is concerned, a lot of people have little freedom in that either. Pregnancy happens to most people, whether they want it or not. It just happens because they don't have freedom with their desires. They don't have control of their lives. Some people have a little bit more of what they call freedom, and they choose to express it in artificial birth control. Uh-oh, he's getting into even this so-called freedom is not the kind of freedom that we are looking for. It's not a positive freedom. It's not an Aquarian freedom. It's negative. And it's deathly, just like everything else that we do in this deathly, sinful, materialistic consciousness that we have. What we're talking about here is we're addressing a kind of deed in a chain of deeds or in a chain of events in the stream of life. All deeds, every deed is finalizing, because in every deed the cause dies and the effect or the consequence is born when the cause dies. Whether it is a large deed like one life, or whether it is a small deed like one kind word to someone else. What is important in what we're discussing is the purpose and the timing of our deeds. If the deathly deed occurs after the terminal of birth, we call it homicide. Sometimes we call it justifiable homicide, as in the case of justifiable wars. Hard words for me to even speak. I don't want to pass judgment. And what I'm about to say is going to have a little bit of judgment in it. But I'm deeply troubled. I love the whole idea of standing up to abortion. But with regard to life after birth, it troubles me that the Right to Life movement is filled with people that believe in capital punishment. You know, why are you trying to save a life that you're going to destroy later on? And it's filled with hawkish people that want to go to war and use young people as cannon fodder. And usually the people who go into the services to die are the people who come from have the least opportunities. Killing bodies, just killing bodies. It's a society that gives up and says it can't redeem someone by prison, or that God can't redeem that person over a long amount of time in prison. That society is morally defeated. Morally bankrupt. If the deathly deed occurs after conception but before birth, we call it abortion rather than homicide. The notion that is put forth is that if it hasn't been born, it isn't a living being. Now, any mother, I'm not even a parent, and I can see it, that the tiniest infant, from the moment it's born, has character. It's got a distinct character that's all of its own. I don't believe that passing out of the womb is a magical act that made that character suddenly come into being. It was there all along. From the astrological point of view, it's very important at that moment of birth, when we take that first breath, and we're much, much, much more sensitive than, like a little child is all eyes and ears. That infant, when it comes out of the womb, is all the more sensitive, many times more sensitive, so that the whole staff of the universe is taken in that first breath. That is important. But important as that moment is, it's important because it puts our character in harmony with the cosmos. But that first breath does not form the character. It takes many lives under various kinds of conditions and all kinds of moral struggle to form character. One moment doesn't do it. And from an astrological point of view, we are born when we are born because of what we are. And we are not what we are because of when we were born. I'll repeat that because that's really important, a misunderstanding that many people have about astrology. We are born when we are born because of what we are. We are not what we are because of when we were born. So, as important as that moment is, it doesn't form character. Not at all. It takes a lot of work to form character. So, the whole idea that abortion is not taking away a life, is not frustrating the character development, is patently wrong. If the deathly deed occurs before conception, we call it birth control. From a spiritual point of view, birth control can be accomplished at various levels and by various means. In our times, in the world, birth control means blocking the physical etheric conception, either by some kind of hormone or some kind of device or something like that. It can be done by blocking or cutting off the desire behind the deed. Some spiritual schools practice that. It can be done by blocking or cutting off the thought that is behind the desire. All of those are methods of birth control. But all of those methods of birth control are negative. They are destructive. They are deathly. All of them are deathly to the creative stream. To not do something is not a form of freedom. It's a step toward it in some ways, but it's negative. All of these forms of so-called birth control are fraught with futility and usually selfishness. If you think about it, birth control in this sense is wanting to enjoy the pleasure of a cause without ever letting it come to a consequence. There's no fulfillment. There's no follow-through. There's no completion. And even if you're successful in that idea of success, and you experience pleasure, and you experience all the rev and the desire body and all of that, you're still frustrated. You have not carried something through to its end. So it is deathly, and it's negative. Now, there's a whole lot more that we could say about this, but we don't have time to go into it because it would distract from the topic. It's enough, I think, to say that sexual experience, the pleasure of it, the emotional experience of it, the thought of it, can be an intense and meaningful experience. But it can't hold a candle to bringing up a child, to helping a new life form of. It can't possibly do that because the whole life is full. It has a life of its own, and it carries through all of the different stages of life. The time to assert positive birth control is at the beginning of the chain, at the conception of the thought. When we take an intuitive impulse from the life spirit, the love, light, the creativity of that intuitive impulse, and when we wrap a thought around it, a vacuous thought around it in the world of archetypes, in the world of concrete thought, that's a positive experience. We're not cutting anything off. We're not blocking anything. We're building something. We're freely taking the life spirit into our hands, and we're taking all of the purpose of it, all of the altruistic love of it, and we're carrying it out. We're taking unadulterated truth, and we're taking it through a creative experience. Manifesting in this way is thoroughly positive. This is expressing life at its very, very best. It's carrying something out. It's giving it all the limitations so that it can be carried out to its very best way. When we turn to the other terminal, the terminal of death, it has its own ironies about it. We can have a lot of negativity just beyond the dread or the fear of death. And a lot of the negativity about death is much more subtle. And it's much more, goes much more into the heart of the spirit than just fear of death, or the fear of facing the consequences. I want to talk about one small aspect of death to get to the basic idea I'm trying to get at in the whole talk, and that is the idea of freedom. I like literature a lot, and in literature is a case of the kind of negativity about death and freedom that we're looking at in the writings of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was a Scorpio, big time he was a Scorpio. He wrote a book called The Possessed, and sometimes it's interpreted as The Devils. And in that book he has an unusual man whose name is Shatov. And Shatov believes that the only free act that a human being can make is to commit suicide. It's a most unusual idea. Shatov explains it to people, and he says, we're all bound by the law or the instinct for preservation. All of our other drives to civilization, to culture, to creativity, to procreation, they're all manifestations of this biological principle of preservation of the self or preservation of the species. Now, in one way or another, many people believe this way. They believe that immortality is carried out through their descendants and through their descendants and so on through time. And that the creation is carried on serially rather than momentally in eternity. A lot of people think that this is the way we become immortal. The fact is that a deep and completely thought out martyrdom, which is a special kind of suicide, is a very rare thing. There's plenty of fanaticism, and there's plenty of zealous suicide. We're seeing it almost every day now. That's something relatively easy. All you have to do is rev yourself up zealously, and you go out and do it. That's not the same thing as the deliberated martyrdom. And the deliberated martyrdom usually isn't a suicide. It is allowing your life to be taken. So Shatov, when he follows out his thinking, he believes, or he concludes, that if one is deliberately and with full self-consciousness committing suicide, that it is a divine act because it goes beyond nature and it goes beyond biological instinct. So that's why he thinks it's the only free human act. In part, he is right. In a deeply deliberated suicide, which is rare, one does go beyond everything that has been built into us. There's no doubt that in some ways it is a free act. But it's very rare because most suicides have a kind of psychodetermination, and they're in a psychological syndrome which makes them think that they are freely taking their life, which is not really freely taking their life. It's an unnatural act, but then most of the things that we're doing in our mystical pursuit is unnatural. Nature is the unconscious expression of spirit. And in many respects, nature is the adversary, or at least the adversarial ground to the spirit. Spirit is unnatural. It's divine. There is a difficulty, though, of the argument of Shatov, or the argument of Dostoevsky, but that difficulty is not in its logic. The difficulty is that the thinking is not carried far enough. It's another one of those deathly arguments, sort of like Mark Twain talks about. He has a short story where he talks about the people up near the Arctic Circle, that somebody has stolen some hand-carved whalebone fish hooks, and they accuse this one rich person of stealing them, and they do the trial by truth. And they go out on the ice and they cut a big hole in the ice, and they throw the person in, and the person sinks. And when the person sinks, that proves that they were innocent. And there's it's that same kind of thinking. You prove that you're divine by destroying your body. It has that same kind of deathly negativity about it, that scorpionic negativity. If the thinking is taken further, one step further, everything changes. If we once realize that we are free at any and every moment to destroy our body, but we choose to not do so, and we choose to not do so for something greater than ourselves, then we are free. Most people are fighting for their lives instinctually. The Shatov suicide is free but negative. What we are looking to do is to live in freedom, knowing that we could die and that we could take our life, but we, in a positive way, really choose to live. That's positive living. That's not a negative higher life, a life with a capital L. And we live it with a love, with a sacrifice that we're willing to even take on all of the sorrows or whatever is necessary to live and to live in full consciousness. That's positive. So that we can see from these two terminals, whether we look backward or forward, from birth to death or death to birth, we can live lives of freedom in a very, very high sense. And to give order to Dostoevsky in the novel is that Shatov eventually does take that final step, and he does live for life. And you know how it happens? It happens when he sees his wife give birth to a child, and he can see that there are two distinct lives there, and it's not just a biological phenomenon. And he sees the miracle, and he sees the wonder of giving life in that manner, and it is a thoroughly positive thing. So even though Dostoevsky looked at those thoughts, he did take the pro-life view of it. So hopefully we've taken a little journey, and we can look and see a little bit better what Christ says. He says, I give you life more abundant.